The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a relentless, gray sheet, turning the gravel of the drive into a soupy mire and drumming a somber, monotonous rhythm on the slate roof of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the house felt just as damp, a chill seeping from the stone walls that no fire seemed capable of chasing away. Eleonora felt it in her bones, a familiar ache that had less to do with the weather and more to do with the oppressive quiet of a home that was slowly dying. She sat by the tall, mullioned window of the morning room, her mending untouched in her lap, watching the water trace crooked paths down the glass. The world outside was a watercolor painting, left out in a storm, its colors bleeding into a uniform, melancholic haze. Her cousin Julian had been in a foul temper all day, his mood as bleak as the sky. The impending arrival of the Duke of Allister was the cause, a visit that felt less like a social call and more like the arrival of an undertaker. The Duke owned Blackwood, a minor and forgotten property in his vast portfolio, inherited from a distant relation. He had never seen it, and the single terse letter from his solicitor had made his intentions clear. He was coming to assess the estate for a final sale. For Julian, who had lived his entire life here on the Duke's sufferance, it was the end of a world. For Eleonora, it was merely the trading of one gilded cage for another, less certain one. She was a poor relation, a silent fixture in the house, useful for mending linens, balancing the near-empty household accounts, and fading into the background whenever guests were present. A sudden commotion from the stable yard broke the house's torpor. Shouts, sharp and panicked, cut through the drone of the rain. Eleonora leaned closer to the window, her brow furrowing. She saw two grooms scrambling backward from the stable doors, their faces pale with fear. A third man lay on the muddy ground, clutching his arm and groaning. Then the source of the chaos emerged, a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like wet jet even in the dim light, burst into the yard. Its eyes were wide, rolling with terror, and a length of broken rope trailed from its halter. It reared, hooves slicing the air, a sound of pure primal panic tearing from its throat. It was the Duke's horse, arrived ahead of him. A creature of immense power and breeding, now utterly consumed by fear. Eleonora watched as the head groom, Mr. Davies, a man of considerable size and experience, tried to approach, his hand outstretched, his voice a low, coaxing rumble. The stallion would have none of it. It shied violently, spinning on its haunches and lashing out with its back legs, the iron-shod hooves connecting with a sickening crack against a water trough, splintering the old wood. The men fell back again, a helpless circle of fear around a vortex of equine terror. Julian appeared at the back door, his face a mask of impotent fury. "Get control of that beast! Do you know what it is worth?" His voice, thin and reedy, only served to agitate the animal further. Something inside Eleonora shifted. It was not a thought, but an impulse, a deep, resonant pull she had always felt toward creatures in distress. She placed her sewing basket carefully on the floor, rose, and walked out of the morning room. She ignored Julian's sharp, questioning glare as she passed him in the hall and slipped out the side door into the rain. The cold water plastered her thin muslin dress to her skin almost instantly, but she paid it no mind. Her focus was entirely on the horse. The men in the yard saw her approach, and one of the younger grooms waved her back frantically. "Miss Eleonora, no! He's mad!" She did not stop. She did not look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the stallion, on the trembling of its powerful flanks, the wild terror in its dark, intelligent eyes. She understood. He was in a strange place, surrounded by strangers, frightened by the storm. His fear was a wild thing, but it was still only fear. She began to hum, a low, tuneless sound deep in her throat. It was an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a simple melody that spoke of safety and quiet fields at dusk. She did not walk directly toward him, but instead began to move in a slow, deliberate arc, keeping her body relaxed, her hands loose at her sides. The rain ran down her face, dripping from her chin, but her expression was one of perfect, placid calm. The stallion stopped its frantic pacing. Its head came up, ears swiveling to pinpoint the source of the new sound. It watched her, its nostrils flaring, still snorting with suspicion, but the panicked rearing had ceased. Eleonora transitioned from humming to singing, her voice soft and low, barely audible above the rain. The words were nonsense, fragments of the lullaby. But the tone was everything. It was a sound that asked for nothing, threatened nothing. It was simply there, a small point of stillness in the chaos. She was 20 feet away, then 10. The men held their breath. Julian watched from the doorway, his mouth agape. She stopped a few feet from the horse's head, still singing. She did not reach out. She simply stood, a slight, drenched figure in the gray rain, offering nothing but the quiet reassurance of her voice. The great horse lowered its head. It took a hesitant step toward her, then another. It stretched out its neck and sniffed at her outstretched hand, its warm breath ghosting over her cold skin. She fell silent. Slowly, ever so slowly, she lifted her other hand and laid it gently on the strong column of his neck. The muscles beneath his skin were bunched and hard, but they did not flinch from her touch. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a release of tension so profound it seemed to shake his entire frame. She began to murmur to him again, stroking his neck, his cheek, her fingers finding the frantic pulse beneath his jaw and feeling it gradually begin to slow. Unseen by any of them, a carriage had pulled to a halt at the main gate, its occupant watching the entire scene unfold. Alistair, the Duke of Alistair, sat and observed from the shadows of his carriage, having ordered his driver to stop. He had seen his horse, Thanatos, a creature he had raised from a foal, throw 3 of his most experienced men at his own estate before the journey. He had seen the terror in the eyes of the grooms at Blackwood, and then he had seen her, a woman walking into the heart of that storm of fear with nothing but a song. He watched her place a hand on the beast's neck, a gesture of such serene confidence it defied belief. The horse, which had been a whirlwind of panicked muscle moments before, now stood as still as a statue under her touch, its head bowed. His estate manager, a practical man named Henderson, sat beside him. "Remarkable, Your Grace." The horse had thrown 3 grown men. She just walked up and started singing. Alistair did not reply. He was a man who dealt in facts, in ledgers, in the cold, hard calculus of profit and loss. He had come to Blackwood to excise a piece of his portfolio that was sentimental and therefore inefficient. He had no time for crumbling manors and the ghosts of forgotten relatives. But what he had just witnessed was not on any ledger. It was not a fact that could be quantified or sold. He watched the woman, her plain brown hair plastered to her skull, her dress a sodden ruin, as she took the broken rope in her hand and gently, calmly, led the most valuable and dangerous horse he owned back toward the stable as if she were leading a lamb. He had intended to stay one night, sign the necessary papers, and be gone. He found himself reconsidering. That evening, dinner was a strained and miserable affair. The Duke was a formidable presence, a man whose silence seemed to carry more weight than other men's entire speeches. He was younger than Eleonora had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a severe, handsome face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and then left out in the wind and rain. Grief and responsibility had etched fine lines around his eyes and mouth, and he wore his title not like a crown, but like a suit of heavy, ill-fitting armor. He spoke little, his gray eyes missing nothing, his attention a palpable force in the room. Julian, desperate to ingratiate himself, chattered nervously, his laughter too loud in the cavernous dining room. His wife, Clara, a woman of vapid beauty and nervous disposition, echoed his sentiments with breathless agreement. They spoke of London society, of people the Duke surely knew, of balls and hunts he had surely attended. He answered their queries with a curt nod or a monosyllabic reply, his gaze sweeping over the threadbare tapestry on the wall, the tarnished silver on the table, the subtle signs of decay that were everywhere. His assessment was clear, and it was damning. Eleonora remained silent, as was her custom. She had changed into her best dress, a simple gray silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit. She felt the Duke's eyes on her several times, a brief, assessing glance that was entirely different from the way men usually looked at her, which was to say, they usually did not look at her at all. She was part of the furniture of Blackwood, unremarkable and constant. But his gaze was sharp, inquisitive. It made her feel for the first time in a very long time visible. After a particularly long and awkward silence, Julian, emboldened by wine, gestured toward Eleonora with a dismissive wave of his hand. "My cousin has a way with animals, Your Grace. Quite the rustic charm. She spends more time in the stables than in the drawing room, I'm afraid." The comment was meant to be a charming, self-deprecating jest about their country ways, but the barb was directed squarely at her, a reminder of her lowly, almost feral status in the household. The Duke turned his cool gaze from Julian to Eleonora. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant. "Your cousin possesses a rare and valuable courage, Mr. Thorne. It is a quality I find lacking in most drawing rooms." The rebuke was quiet, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Julian's face flushed a blotchy red. Clara stared down at her plate. The air thickened with unspoken resentment. For the rest of the meal, Eleonora could feel Julian's anger radiating toward her from across the table, a cold and bitter heat. The Duke had defended her. It was a small thing, a single sentence, but in the silent, stratified world of Blackwood Manor, it was a tectonic shift. The next day, the rain had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a watery sun. The Duke announced his intention to inspect the estate ledgers. Julian, who had not looked at them in years, paled. "Of course, Your Grace, of course. I shall have them brought to you in the study." He scurried off, shouting for the housekeeper. Eleonora knew where the ledgers were. She was the one who maintained them, who tried to make sense of the dwindling funds and Julian's increasingly erratic and inexplicable expenditures. She found him in the library, a vast, cold room that smelled of dust and decaying paper. He stood before a towering shelf of books, his hand resting on a leather-bound spine. He did not seem to be reading the titles. He was simply standing there, lost in thought, a solitary figure dwarfed by the weight of generations of forgotten words. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Thorne, Your Grace, Julian, my cousin, asked me to fetch the ledgers for you. They are kept here." She moved to a large oak desk in the corner of the room, its surface buried under a fine layer of dust. She opened a wide, deep drawer and retrieved the heavy, calfskin-bound books. There were 3 of them, a decade's worth of decline recorded in her neat, precise hand. "You are the bookkeeper." He had not moved from his spot by the shelves. "There is no one else to do it." She placed the ledgers on the desk, the sound a dull thud in the quiet room. "The accounts are not in good order, I'm afraid. The estate yields very little." He walked over to the desk, his boots silent on the threadbare Persian rug. He did not look at the books. He looked at her. "The horse, Thanatos. He has not let a stranger touch him since he was a colt. How did you do it?" Eleonora felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks. She was used to discussing crop yields and repair costs, not matters of intuition. "He was afraid. I simply did not give him another reason to be." She looked down at her hands, resting on the dusty cover of the topmost ledger. Sometimes, quiet is more effective than force. His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Yes," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "I am beginning to believe it is." He opened the first ledger. For the next hour, they stood side by side at the desk, the library their sanctuary from the rest of the house. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. She answered them with a quiet competence that he found more compelling than any drawing-room wit. She knew the yield of every field, the cost of every necessary repair, the name of every tenant family. She had carried the burdens of this estate in secret, her diligence a quiet, steady flame in a house succumbing to darkness and neglect. And as he listened, Alistair, the Duke who had come to sell a piece of his past, found himself becoming dangerously interested in its future. Their meetings in the library became a daily ritual. Julian, relieved to be free of the Duke's scrutinizing presence, left them to it. He assumed the Duke was merely performing his due diligence before the sale, and that Eleonora was a convenient, unpaid clerk. He could not have been more wrong. For Alistair and Eleonora, the dusty, forgotten room became a world unto itself. It was a space defined not by social standing or expectation, but by a shared purpose. The ledgers were the text of their conversations, but the subtext was something else entirely. He discovered the depth of her intelligence, the methodical way her mind worked, piecing together the fractured puzzle of the estate's finances. She saw past his title to the man beneath, a man weary of sycophants and fortune hunters, who seemed to relax only in her presence. He would watch her as she worked, the way a stray lock of hair would fall across her brow as she bent over the columns of figures, the unconscious grace with which she moved. These small observations felt more profound to him than any grand gesture. One afternoon, she was explaining a discrepancy in the accounts from the previous year, a significant sum marked for roof repairs that had clearly never been made. Her finger traced the line of spidery ink where Julian had recorded the expense. Alistair leaned closer to see, his shoulder brushing against hers. The contact was slight, accidental, but it sent a jolt through Eleonora. She stopped speaking, her breath catching in her throat. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a sudden, intense awareness. He did not pull away. The warmth of his body next to hers was a solid, grounding presence. He was looking not at the ledger, but at her face. "He stole it," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken truth of Julian's betrayal and the startling intimacy of their proximity. He finally straightened, breaking the contact, but the space where they had touched continued to tingle with a phantom heat. "Show me the rest," he commanded, his voice rougher than before. The moment had passed, but something had irrevocably changed. A line had been crossed, a silent acknowledgement that their connection was no longer merely about the business of the estate. It was about trust. Julian's resentment, however, was a poison that seeped into the foundations of the house. He saw the hours Eleonora spent with the Duke, saw the way the Duke's eyes followed her when she entered a room, and his jealousy curdled into a venomous suspicion. He could not conceive of a man like Alistair being interested in a woman like Eleonora for her mind or her character. In his world, such transactions were always simpler, baser. He began to make small, cutting remarks in her presence, alluding to her ambition, her cleverness in catching the Duke's eye. The campaign of subtle humiliations escalated. He started giving her menial tasks in front of the Duke, asking her to fetch his boots, to mend a tear in his coat, to serve the tea as if she were a common housemaid. Eleonora performed each task with a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate Julian further. She would not be provoked. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Alistair watched it all, his face a mask of cold fury, his silence more damning than any outburst. He was gathering evidence, not just from the ledgers, but from the daily cruelties he witnessed. The breaking point came during a small dinner party Julian insisted on hosting for some of their more prominent neighbors. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to display a grandeur he no longer possessed and to show the Duke that he was a man of local standing. The entire affair was a farce. The wine was cheap, the food was mediocre, and the conversation was stilted. Julian, drinking far too much, grew louder and more reckless as the evening wore on. He had seated Eleonora at the far end of the table, next to a deaf old squire, effectively isolating her. But it was not enough. He needed a more public victory. During a lull in the conversation, he raised his glass, a malicious gleam in his eye. "A toast," he announced, his voice slurring slightly. "To my dear cousin Eleonora, a woman of hidden talents. She has a remarkable ability to make herself indispensable. One might almost call it a professional skill. I am sure the Duke has found her services most valuable during his stay." The implication was grotesque and unmistakable. A wave of shocked silence fell over the table. The female guests flushed and looked away. The men shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. Eleonora felt the blood drain from her face. It was as if the floor had dropped away from beneath her, leaving her exposed and utterly alone. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She kept her spine straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. She would not look at him. She would not let him see her pain. But then a voice, cold and sharp as breaking ice, cut through the silence. "You will apologize to your cousin." Now, it was the Duke. He had risen to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He stood at his full height, a figure of absolute, uncompromising authority. His face was pale with a rage so profound it seemed to suck the very warmth from the room. He was looking at Julian with an expression of such pure contempt that Julian physically recoiled. I was merely jesting, Your Grace," Julian stammered, his drunken bravado evaporating in an instant. "There is no jest in what you have said." Alistair's voice was lethally quiet. "You have insulted a woman whose integrity is worth more than this entire estate. You have slandered her in front of your guests to soothe your own pathetic, thieving pride." He let the word thieving hang in the air. A declaration of war. He then turned his eyes to the rest of the table, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the guests. "Miss Thorne has more honor and intelligence in her little finger than your host has in his entire body. She has been the sole steward of this mismanaged land, the only person fighting to hold it together while he pointed a finger at Julian, has been bleeding it dry." He walked around the table until he stood behind Eleonora's chair. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was firm, protective, a public claiming. "I came to this place to rid myself of a property I cared nothing for. I am staying because I have found something of infinite value here." He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw not the cool, remote Duke, but a man of deep, unguarded emotion. His eyes were filled with a fierce tenderness that made her heart ache. He then turned his attention back to the stunned assembly. "This dinner is over. I suggest you all leave." It was not a request. It was a command. There was a frantic, clumsy scramble as the guests, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere, rose and made their hasty farewells, avoiding eye contact with Julian, who had sunk into his chair, his face the color of ash. Within minutes, the room was empty, save for the three of them. Julian, Clara, who was weeping silently into her napkin, and Eleonora, with the Duke's hand still resting on her shoulder. The public defense had been absolute. The humiliation Julian had intended for her had been turned back on him with devastating force. Alistair had not only shielded her, he had championed her, declaring her worth to the world that had always deemed her worthless. The quiet girl in the corner had been seen, and the world of Blackwood Manor had been fractured to its very core. After the guests had fled, and Julian had stumbled away in a drunken, defeated haze, Alistair led Eleonora from the dining room. He did not take her to the drawing room, but to the library, their sanctuary. The room was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the tall windows. He did not release her until they were standing before the great oak desk, the ledgers still lying there like silent witnesses. He finally took his hand from her shoulder and turned to face her, his expression serious. "He will not trouble you again," he said. It was a promise. Eleonora was still trembling from the ordeal, a fine internal shiver that would not cease. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice husky. "You did not have to—" "Yes," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I did. I have stood by and watched his petty cruelties for days, and I have said nothing. That was my mistake. Tonight, I could not remain silent." He looked around the dark, shadowed room, at the towering shelves of books that had borne witness to their developing trust. "This place, these books, they are just objects, wood and paper and ink. I came here to dispose of them. I have spent my life managing things, estates, titles, fortunes, all of it inherited, none of it truly earned. My father, the last Duke, he loved this sort of life. The parties, the society, I have always found it hollow." He moved to the window, staring out at the moon-drenched landscape. It was the first time he had ever spoken of himself, of his own feelings. This was the private confession she had not known she was waiting for. "My wife," he began, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear him, "was a celebrated beauty. Our marriage was considered the match of the season. She was charming, witty, admired by all. And she was utterly bored with me. She found her amusement elsewhere. When she died in a riding accident, the world mourned a diamond of the first water. I mourned the lie our entire life had been. I closed myself off. I decided to trust only in what was tangible, what could be measured and counted. That is why I came here. To sell the last piece of sentimental nonsense my family owned." He turned back to face her, his face half in shadow, half in moonlight. The granite mask was gone, replaced by a profound and aching vulnerability. "And then I saw you. In the rain. You walked into a storm of chaos and met it not with force, but with stillness. With a strength that has nothing to do with titles or wealth. And every day since, in this room, I have seen that same strength. Your integrity. Your quiet, unyielding competence. You have been managing a ruin, Eleonora, and you have done it with more grace and honor than I have managed my entire duchy." He took a step closer to her, his eyes searching her face. "Julian accused you of having ambition. He is a fool. You have no ambition. You have worth, a worth he is too blind and corrupt to see, a worth that He paused, struggling for the right words. "A worth that I have come to value more than anything I own." The revelation of his past, the raw honesty of his confession, stripped away the last of Eleonora's defenses. She saw him then, not as the Duke of Alistair, but as a man who was just as lonely as she was, a man who had been wounded by the very world that was supposed to have given him everything. Her own sense of isolation, the quiet ache she had carried for years, seemed to lessen in the shared space of his vulnerability. He had called her by her first name. It was the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both startling and deeply, wonderfully right. The crisis of Julian's theft and public disgrace had irrevocably altered the landscape. There was no going back to the way things were. Eleonora knew this. Her cousin's power was broken, his character exposed. But she was now in a new, uncertain position. The Duke had defended her, championed her. But what did that mean for her future? Was she to become his ward? A glorified housekeeper for the estate he now seemed inclined to keep? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She had been dependent on Julian's whims for years. She could not bear to simply trade one form of dependency for another, no matter how benevolent the master. Her integrity demanded she stand on her own feet, even if the ground beneath them was unsteady. The next morning, she sought him out. She found him not in the library, but in the stables, running a hand down the powerful neck of Thanatos. The great horse stood peacefully in his stall, nudging the Duke's shoulder with his nose. He looked up as she approached, a small, weary smile touching his lips. It transformed his severe face, making him look younger, more approachable. "He is calm this morning," she observed, her voice quiet. "He is," Alistair agreed. "I believe he likes it here. The air is cleaner than in London." He turned his full attention to her. "I have sent for my solicitor. We will deal with your cousin's accounts. You and his wife will be provided for, of course. He will be given a small annuity and sent abroad. It is the most merciful solution." Eleonora nodded, appreciating the swift, decisive action, but she had to speak her mind. "Your Grace," she began, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "I am deeply grateful for your intervention. You have shown me a kindness I have not known in a very long time. But I cannot remain here as your dependent. I must find a position, a governess perhaps, or a companion." A shadow crossed his face. He looked genuinely taken aback. "Leave? Why would you leave?" "Because I must," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "My whole life has been lived on the charity of others. I have balanced the books for a man who despised me because it was the price of my keep. I cannot live that way again. I must earn my own way." It was the bravest speech she had ever made, a declaration of her own worth spoken not to a hostile audience, but to the one man who might actually understand it. He was silent for a long time, studying her face, his gray eyes intense. The scent of hay and horse and old leather filled the space between them. "I see," he said at last. He looked from her to the horse and back again. "You are right, of course. To ask you to stay as a dependent would be an insult to the very qualities I admire in you." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them until they were only an arm's length apart. "But I am not asking you to be my dependent, Eleonora. I am asking you to be my partner." Her heart seemed to stop. She stared at him, unable to process the word. "Partner? I have spent the last 5 years of my life drowning in paperwork, in social obligations, in a profound and soul-crushing loneliness," he continued, his voice low and earnest, stripped of all ducal artifice. "I have managed my duties, but I have not lived. Coming here, I thought I was closing a book. Instead, I feel as if I am at the beginning of the first chapter. This estate, it is a ruin, yes, but it has potential. It needs someone with a keen eye and a steady hand, someone who understands it. It needs you." He reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm. It was not the brief, accidental touch of the library. This was deliberate, intentional, an anchor. "And I," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "find that I need you." He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze clear and unwavering. "I am not looking for a duchess to host parties and wear jewels. I have had that. I am looking for a partner to help me restore this estate, to build a life here. A partner to talk with in the library at the end of the day. A wife? I am asking you to marry me, Eleonora. Not because you are a convenient solution, but because you are the most competent, honorable, and courageous woman I have ever met. I am asking because I believe my life will be a cold and empty thing without you in it." The proposal was everything she could never have dreamed of. He did not speak of love in grand, poetic terms. He spoke of partnership, of respect, of need. He was not offering her a title as a prize. He was offering her a position at his side, a shared life built on the foundations of mutual esteem. He was choosing her, the quiet, overlooked woman, for the very things the world had always ignored: her mind, her integrity, her quiet strength. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sadness or fear, but of a profound and overwhelming relief. It was the feeling of being truly seen, truly understood, for the first time in her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alistair." His face broke into a genuine, radiant smile. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, gray winter. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound respect. The acceptance was her choice, an act of trust in the man, not the Duke. It was the culmination of every quiet moment in the library, every shared glance, every unspoken understanding. It was the quiet sound of two lonely souls finding their harbor in each other. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Julian was formally dispossessed. Faced with the evidence of his embezzlement and the full weight of the Duke's authority, he crumbled. He and Clara were gone within the week, dispatched to a dreary, remote corner of the continent with a pittance that would ensure they never troubled English society again. Their defeat was not dramatic. It was absolute and silent, a quiet removal from the board. They had built their world on a foundation of superficiality and social standing, and against the genuine connection and integrity of Alistair and Eleonora, it had simply dissolved. The wedding was a small, private affair, held not in a grand London cathedral, but in the ancient stone chapel on the grounds of Blackwood Manor. There were no crowds, no society reporters, only a handful of tenants, the loyal household staff, and Henderson, the Duke's estate manager, who stood as his witness. Eleonora wore a simple cream-colored dress, and in her hair she wore not jewels, but a few late-blooming roses from the manor's neglected garden, which she had started to tend. As she stood before the altar, with Alistair's hand holding hers, she felt a sense of peace so profound it felt like coming home. She was not a penniless relation gaining a title. She was a woman choosing her partner, entering into a union of equals. He looked at her not with possession, but with a deep and abiding respect that was more precious to her than any diamond. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was not one of fiery passion, but of quiet, certain joy, a promise of shared mornings in the library and peaceful evenings by the fire. It was the beginning of a life, not a fairy tale. 1 year later, the rain was falling again. It was a soft, gentle autumn rain this time, tapping a soothing rhythm against the new panes of glass in the library window. A warm fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. The shelves were no longer dusty, the books organized and cared for. The threadbare rug had been replaced by a thick, warm Axminster, and comfortable chairs were drawn up near the fire. The room was no longer a tomb of forgotten words, but the living heart of the house. Eleonora, now the Duchess of Alistair, sat at the great oak desk, a ledger open before her. But this ledger was different from the old ones. The columns were filled with positive figures, with investments in new crops, with funds for tenant cottages, with plans for a new school in the village. The ink was black and confident. Blackwood was breathing again. Alistair entered the room carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. He placed one on the desk beside her and took the chair opposite, stretching his long legs toward the fire. He had changed in the past year. The harsh lines on his face had softened, the weary weight in his eyes replaced by a quiet contentment. He no longer wore his title like armor. He wore it like a comfortable coat, a responsibility he now shared. He watched her for a moment, a fond smile playing on his lips. "Still balancing the books, my love?" She looked up, her own smile matching his. "Someone has to. You would spend a fortune on that new breed of cattle if I did not keep an eye on you." Her voice was light, filled with an easy, teasing affection that had grown between them. "And I would be a poorer man for it in every way that matters," he replied, his voice sincere. He reached across the desk and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They sat there in comfortable silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle drumming of the rain. It was in these quiet moments that their life was built, a mosaic of small, shared gestures and unspoken understanding. Later, they walked out to the stables, a shared habit from the earliest days of their acquaintance. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and hay. Thanatos nickered a soft greeting as they approached his stall. Eleonora reached in and stroked his soft nose, murmuring to him in the same low, soothing tone she had used on that first day. The great horse rested his head against her shoulder, calm and trusting. Alistair stood beside her, his arm around her waist, holding her close. "He knew, you know," he said quietly. "From the very first moment. He knew you were different." She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking at the magnificent animal that had, in its own way, been the catalyst for everything. The chaos that had led to this profound and unexpected peace. She thought of the woman she had been, the silent, invisible girl who believed her worth was measured only by her usefulness. And she thought of the man beside her, the cold, grieving Duke who had come to sell a piece of his past and had instead found his future. Their story was not one of a dramatic rescue, but of a quiet recognition. He had not saved her. He had seen her, and in seeing her, he had saved himself. True value, she had come to understand, was not found in titles or fortunes or in the loud pronouncements of the world. It was found in the quiet, unwatched moments, in the steady competence of a hand balancing a ledger, in the courage to speak the truth in a room full of lies, and in the gentle, unwavering voice that could calm a storm, be it in the heart of a frightened horse or the soul of a lonely man. It was a worth measured not by what you owned or who you were, but by the steady, quiet light of your own integrity, a light that, once seen, could illuminate the entire world